There is a name you have never heard come out of her mouth. Not in interviews, not in documentaries, not even in those carefully controlled, perfectly edited moments where every word is chosen like it's part of a script. And that's strange, isn't it? Because this isn't just any name. It belongs to a daughter. A daughter who grew up watching her own mother become one of the most recognizable women on the planet, watching her walk beside Prince Harry, speak about love, speak about truth, speak about never abandoning the people who matter. And yet, not once did she hear her own name as, "Oh, let me ask you something. How does a woman build an entire global identity around compassion, while a piece of her past sits in complete silence?" And why now, after all these years, is that silence starting to crack? Because the man who was there before everything changed, before the fame, before the palace, before the world knew her as Meghan Markle, has finally stopped staying quiet. And what he's revealing, it didn't just shake headlines, it left a prince in tears. Stay with me, because this story doesn't get cleaner from here, it gets darker. Then let's go deeper, because the silence didn't just appear overnight. It started long before the cameras, long before the titles, long before the world ever learned her name. Back when everything was simpler, or at least that's what people thought. Before the palace doors opened, before global headlines turned her into a symbol, there was another life quietly unfolding behind the scenes. A version of her that didn't need press teams, didn't need carefully worded interviews, didn't need a narrative, because it hadn't been built yet. And standing right there, in that earlier chapter, was a man the world barely talks about now. Trevor Engelson. Not a prince, not royalty, just someone who saw everything before it was refined. He wasn't part of the fairy tale. He was part of the draft that got deleted. And for years, he said nothing. Think about that. In a world where people sell stories for headlines, where even the smallest connection to fame gets turned into a book deal or a tell-all interview, he stayed completely silent. No explosive interviews. No emotional confessions. No late-night truth reveals. Just silence. But silence like that doesn't come from nowhere. It usually protects something or someone. Because people close to that chapter describe a shift. Not sudden, not dramatic, but slow, calculated, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. The kind of shift where circles start changing. Old friends? Gradually gone. Familiar faces? Replaced. New connections? Carefully chosen. Not based on loyalty, but on value. Who can open doors? Who can elevate status? Who can move the story forward? And if that sounds harsh, that's because it is. Because what came next wasn't just cold, it was surgical. One morning, without warning, without a real conversation, without closure, a package arrived. No explanation. No emotional goodbye. No attempt to fix anything. Just a box. Inside it, a wedding ring. An engagement ring. Returned. Like something that had simply expired. Like a subscription that was no longer useful. And in that moment, the man who had been there before the world was watching realized something most people would only understand years later. He hadn't lost her. He had been outgrown. But even that wasn't the part he couldn't forget. Because during those years, before the reinvention, before the global stage, there were whispers. Quiet details that didn't fit into the version of the story that would later be told to millions. Fragments of a past that didn't align with the image being built. A chapter that existed, but was never acknowledged. And the closer you look at those early years, the more one question starts to form. What exactly was being left behind, and why? Because reinvention always comes at a cost. You don't just become someone new without letting go of something old. But what happens when what you leave behind isn't just a phase? Not just a relationship. Not just a version of yourself. But a person? A life that continues, whether you acknowledge it or not. And this is where the story stops being about ambition and starts becoming something else entirely. Because the people who were there back then, the ones who watched everything quietly unfold, don't describe chaos. They describe precision. Decisions made not in emotion, but in strategy. Moves that didn't just change a life, but erased parts of it. And for years, none of it mattered. Because the world only saw what it was shown. The interviews, the speeches, the carefully curated truth.
But now,
Now, the version of the story that was never meant to surface is starting to move. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. And the man who once stayed silent? He's no longer protecting the past. He's remembering it. And what he remembers doesn't match the story the world was told. Now here's where the story stops feeling like speculation and starts feeling like something far more deliberate. Because everything we've talked about so far, the silence, the sudden ending, the quiet reinvention, that could all be explained away, right? People change. Relationships end. Lives move on. But this is where the pattern begins to form. Because according to individuals who claim to have been connected to that earlier chapter, there was always something else. Something that didn't fit the narrative that would later be presented to the world. A detail that wasn't just overlooked, it was avoided. Completely. They described conversations that would suddenly shift direction. Mentions that were quickly redirected. Topics that, for reasons no one could quite explain at the time, were treated like they simply didn't exist. And when something is consistently treated like it doesn't exist, it usually means it does. That's when the name starts appearing. Quietly at first. Never publicly. Never on record. But in private circles, among people who had been around long enough to remember the version of her before everything changed, one name kept coming up. A daughter. Not a rumor in the traditional sense. Not gossip thrown around for attention. But something spoken about in lowered voices, like a detail people weren't supposed to repeat. And here's the part that makes it impossible to ignore. This wasn't a story that suddenly appeared after fame. It was something that, according to those same sources, existed long before the cameras ever showed up. Long before the interviews. Long before the speeches about authenticity and truth. Long before the world began listening to every word. Which raises a question that's almost uncomfortable to ask. If this was always there, why was it never acknowledged? Because think about how carefully every part of her public image has been constructed. Every appearance refined. Every statement measured. Every narrative polished until it feels almost untouchable. You don't build something like that by accident. You build it by control. And control requires selection. What gets included, and more importantly, what gets left out. Now here's where things take another turn. Because this isn't just about what was left behind. It's about who knew. And that brings us right back to Trevor Engelson. Because if there was anyone who had access to that version of her life, it was him. He wasn't looking from the outside. He was there. During the years when the foundation was still being built. During the moments when decisions weren't public yet, when they were still private, still forming, still being chosen. And people close to him say something that changes the entire weight of the story. They say he didn't just hear about it. He understood it. Not as a rumor, but as something real enough that it stayed with him, even after everything ended. Now, ask yourself, why would someone carry that kind of information for years and say nothing? No interviews. No accusations. No attempts to expose anything. Just silence. Because silence like that isn't weakness. It's restraint. And restraint usually means one thing, there's more. But what pushed things from quiet understanding into something that couldn't stay buried anymore wasn't just time. It was visibility. Because while all of this remained hidden in the background, something else was happening in the foreground. A completely different narrative was being built. One that centered around compassion. Around empowerment. Around the idea of being a voice for those who feel unseen, unheard, unacknowledged. And for most people watching, it was inspiring. It was powerful. It was believable. Until you place it next to this. Because if even a fraction of what these sources are suggesting is true, then the contrast isn't just uncomfortable. It's explosive. A global figure speaking about never abandoning people, while an alleged part of her own past remains completely unspoken. A voice for authenticity, built on selective silence. And suddenly, the story isn't just about what happened. It's about what doesn't match. Now here's where things become even harder to ignore. Because according to individuals familiar with more recent developments, this information didn't stay confined to private circles. It started moving. Carefully. Quietly. But with intention. And eventually, it reached someone who wasn't supposed to see it this way. Prince Harry. Not through headlines. Not through tabloids. but through conversations that carried a very different weight. Because for him, this wasn't just another rumor. This wasn't just another story to dismiss. This was personal, deeply personal. Because by the time this reached him, he had already built something around a belief. A belief that he was protecting someone. That he had stepped away from everything he knew to stand beside someone who needed that protection. But what happens when the story you thought you understood starts to shift? When details begin to surface that don't align with what you were told? When the person you believed you were defending becomes someone you're trying to understand? Those close to the situation describe his reaction not as explosive, but as quiet. And that's what makes it more unsettling. Because loud reactions pass. Quiet ones stay. They describe a moment of realization that didn't come all at once, but piece by piece. A detail here, a conversation there, a connection forming slowly until it couldn't be ignored anymore. And the part that reportedly stayed with him the most? It wasn't just the possibility of a hidden past. It was the idea of erasure, of someone existing and being left out of a story that had been told to the entire world. Because for someone who has spent his life dealing with loss, with absence, with the weight of someone no longer being there, that hits differently. It's not just a detail. It's a pattern. And patterns are hard to unsee once you recognize them. So now the question isn't just what happened in the past. It's what happens next. Because silence can only hold something for so long. And when it breaks, it doesn't do it quietly. And this is the part where everything stops feeling like a story and starts feeling like a chain reaction. Because once a narrative begins to crack, it doesn't just break in one place. It spreads. Quietly at first, then all at once. And according to people watching this unfold from the inside, that's exactly what's happening now. Not headlines. Not official statements. Patterns. Small ones. Subtle ones. But impossible to ignore once you see them. Separate appearances. Different schedules. Moments where the distance isn't explained, just noticed. And for most people, those things mean nothing. Busy lives. Different priorities. Normal adjustments. But in a situation like this, they mean everything. Because when pressure builds behind the scenes, it doesn't always explode publicly. Sometimes it leaks through behavior, through tone, through silence, through the things people don't say. And right now, there's a lot not being said. Because while the public is still trying to catch up to the possibility of what we've just uncovered, there's another layer forming underneath it. A much bigger one. And it revolves around one question. What happens if the person who knows everything decides to speak? Because up until now, the entire structure of this story has relied on one very specific assumption, that Trevor Engelson would stay exactly where he's been for years. Silent. But that assumption? It's starting to look fragile. Because people connected to industry circles, the same ones who once described him as someone who had moved on, are now saying something very different. They're saying conversations are happening. Careful ones. Controlled ones. But real. Discussions about timelines, about experiences, about what can be said and what can't be stopped once it is. And here's the part that's making everyone uneasy. There was never an agreement that locked him in. No document, no restriction, no line he legally couldn't cross. Which means if he chooses to tell his version of events, there is nothing officially standing in his way. And when that realization started circulating among people connected to her current world, the reaction wasn't calm. It wasn't confident. It wasn't the kind of response you'd expect from someone who feels completely secure in their story. According to individuals who claim to have insight into those moments, it was urgent. Calls being made, messages being sent, attempts to reach people who might still have influence over what happens next. Because when someone who has stayed quiet for years suddenly has the option to speak, you don't wait to see what they'll say. You try to get there first. But here's the uncomfortable truth about that. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to rush. And yet, everything feels rushed. Now bring this back to Prince Harry. Because while all of this is unfolding externally, internally, something very different is happening. Those close to him don't describe anger. They don't describe confrontation. They describe something far more difficult to deal with. Clarity. The kind that doesn't hit like a wave, but settles in slowly. The kind that forces you to revisit moments you thought you understood and see them differently. Conversations that now feel incomplete. Decisions that now feel influenced. A story that now feels edited. Because when new information enters a situation like this, it doesn't just add to the story. It changes the story. And for someone who built his life around protecting others, around making sure history didn't repeat itself, that realization cuts deeper than anything public ever could. Because suddenly, the question isn't just what is true, it's what did I miss? And that's a dangerous place to be. Because once you start asking that question, you don't stop at one answer. You start looking at everything. And when everything starts to look different, so does the future. Now here's where this goes from tension to potential fallout. Because stories like this don't stay contained forever. Not when there are too many moving parts. Not when too many people know fragments of the same truth. Not when silence becomes harder to maintain than speaking. At some point, something gives a statement, an interview, a leak. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be enough. Enough to shift public perception. Enough to make people question what they thought they knew. Enough to turn a controlled narrative into an uncontrollable one. And once that happens, there's no pulling it back. Because public image isn't just built on what's said. It's built on what people believe. And belief is fragile. It can take years to build and seconds to break. So now the situation sits in a place that's more unstable than it's ever been. Not exposed, not confirmed, but not buried either. Suspended, waiting, for the moment something moves just enough to push it into the open. And when that moment comes, it won't just be about a past that was never discussed. It will be about a present that can no longer ignore it. Because at the center of all of this, beyond the headlines, beyond the speculation, beyond the carefully managed versions of events, there's still one detail that refuses to disappear. A name that was never said. A life that continued anyway. A silence that has lasted longer than anyone expected. And the growing possibility that it's about to end. And now we're left with something even more unsettling than the story itself. A silence that lasted for years. A past that never fully disappeared. And a truth that feels like it's still waiting for the right moment to surface. Because if everything you've just heard, even a fraction of it, is real, then this was never just a private chapter. It was a missing piece. A piece that changes how everything else looks once you finally see it. So let me ask you something. Do you really believe this is just another rumor that will fade away? Or does it feel like something bigger, something that's been controlled for far too long? Because stories like this don't just vanish. They pause. They build. They wait. And when they finally come out, they don't come out quietly. They change everything. Now, the real question is, if the silence really does break, if the people who know the truth decide to speak, are we ready to hear it? Or have we already been shown only the version we were supposed to believe? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I want to know what you think is really going on behind all of this. And if you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't over. So make sure you hit subscribe, not just for updates, but for the next chapter. Because trust me, when it finally drops, you will want to hear about it from someone else.